Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Future of Financial Information webinar. And I'm glad that you were still able to join despite the fact that we had to change the time at a rather short notice. So that's not the only thing that's different about today's episode, which makes me happy because it means I have some bit more to say than the usual boilerplate. And so rather than the usual presenter and discussant, we have two presenters with me today. So that's Hao Jiang from Michigan State University and Michael Weber from the University of Chicago. And the reason they are both here today is that they both happen to have very interesting work on an important and contemporary topic of cybersecurity risk. So I learned about both of their respective papers in a fairly similar time. And I thought, well, that sounds like a great fit for this webinar series. And so rather than pick one of the papers over the other, I thought we could just change the format a little bit and have them both appear together in what I maybe a bit cheekily call the research slam. So the way it will work is that Hao and Michel will first each get 15 minutes to present their own paper. And after that, each of them will get about 7-8 minutes to think about how their paper is positioned relative to the other, what's similar, what's different that we learn about cybersecurity risk, and maybe give some suggestions as well. And after that, we'll spend the remaining 15 or so minutes with questions from the audience. But please don't sit on your questions until the end. Feel free to type them into the chat. I will be monitoring the chat throughout, and we'll make sure that we get to your questions at the end of today's event. And so now, without further ado, please, Hao, if you'd like to go first. And the screen is yours for the next 15 minutes.
Sure, thank you. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen? Great. Thank you for the invitation to present this paper in this interesting webinar in a very interesting format. This paper is joint work with Naveen Khanna and Qian, both from Michigan State. Qian is our doctoral student who is on the market this year. If you're hiring, I strongly encourage you to take a look at him. So the digital transformation has been pervasive and accelerating throughout the economy. According to International Data Corporation, 65% of the global GDP will be digitized by 2022. It is also a huge engine for increased connectivity and the data generation. So every running Tesla car in the street is a powerful engine for data generation. According to IDC, in 2020, enterprises created and captured 64 zettabytes of data. 1 zettabyte is 10 with the power of 21. One unintended consequence of this increased digitization is the emerging vulnerability, which we call the cyber risk. Equifax data breach is a prominent example of data breach. It exposed more than 140 million names, birthdays, social security information for more than 140 million people. And also it exposed their credit card information. So according to the settlement, Equifax is willing to pay up to $700 million in this data breach settlement. More recently, we have the SolarWinds hack, which compromises data for both federal governments and private enterprises. So it's a very important issue. There are many questions one can ask about cyber risk. The question we focus on in this paper is how cyber risk impacts stock prices and returns. So in the paper, we have a more formal definition of cyber risk. But practically or econometrically, we define cyber risk as the ex-ante probability for a given company to experience a data breach or successful cyber attack. So now a data breach is a binary event. Therefore, it's a very standard classification problem. A standard tool from econometrics is logistic regression. However, it's well known that the MLE estimator of the conditional density from logistic regression has a finite sample bias. And this bias is magnified when the data is sparse. You have too many zeros, but too few ones. Or we can call that rare events data. To address those biases, we use the correction proposed by Gary Qian and co-author in political science, where the modeling was epidemic, etc. So one limitation of the logistic regression is that it has limited capacity to handle the number of regressors to predict the outcome. Therefore, it's not as powerful as the more contemporary machine learning techniques. Therefore, to increase the flexibility and the power of our forecasting algorithms, we regularize logistic regression with machine learning techniques such as LASSO, REG, and ElasticNet. Because the results are qualitatively similar, so we focus our presentation on logistic LASSO, but we also use support vector machine and obtain qualitatively similar results. Our feature sets come from Camille et al.'s GFE paper. We use the full feature set from their paper. To kind of illustrate the potential flexibility of our approach, we also construct textual variables from the 10K filing item 1A. So we use 3 dictionaries for this purpose. The first one is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They have the glossary of key information security terms. The second one comes from National Initiative for Cybersecurity Careers and Studies. They provide cybersecurity glossary as well. The third one is from insurance company, Cyber Policy. They provide cyber glossary. So those are our textual variables. So in terms of the data, initially we use the data breaches data from Privacy Rights Clearinghouse. Now we use the identity theft resource center data, which has more comprehensive coverage. The sample size expanded dramatically by using that data. Our sample period is from 2005 to 2019, and the rest are fairly standard CRISP compute stat and 10K filings from Logren and McDonough. So to look at the data, the number of incidents of data breaches has been rising over the sample period. At the beginning of the sample, it's around 20. Toward the end, it quadrupled to 80. At the peak, it's more than 120. In terms of industry distribution, financial industries tend to be most vulnerable, followed by manufacturing, information, retail trade, professional and business services, and also education and health services. So now I want to discuss a bit on the performance of the prediction algorithms. So this is the standard confusion matrix. Across columns, that's the predicted outcomes. Across the rows, that's the actual realization. Plain indicates 0 and the hack is 1. So this panel is for the base logic regression. This clearly shows the problem with logistic regression. It overestimates the number of zeros, but underestimates the number of ones. So therefore, this algorithm has good precision, but a very poor recall. In other words, it has too many false negatives. Now, by using LASSO, REG, and ElasticNet, the performance improved substantially. Now we have a much lower number of false negatives. If you compute the average recall and precision, the improvement is dramatic by using the machine learning techniques. To kind of provide some external validity test of our cyber risk measure, we aggregate firm-level cyber risk to the aggregate time series and compute its correlation with the NYU index of cybersecurity, which is the survey data provided by NYU Engineering Department, which they survey cybersecurity professionals every month from 2014. Basically, we find a very strong and a positive co-movement between the NYU ICS index and our cyber risk measure. As another test, we look at the spread between stock returns on those with high cyber risk versus low cyber risk, which is plotted in this blue, solid blue line. This represents the spread in returns between high and low cyber risk, and also cybersecurity ETF returns. We use two cybersecurity ETF. One is CIBR ETF. The other is HACK ETF. So those are the ETFs which represents a portfolio of companies providing cybersecurity services. What we find in the data is that when high cyber risk firms underperform, the cybersecurity ETFs outperform. In other words, there's a very strong negative correlation between the two time series. It's below minus 30% in our sample period. So this provides another illustration of the information contained by the cyber risk measure. So our key test are presented in these two tables. The first one is based on realized stock return. This is coming from FAME-MCBETH regression using cyber risk to predict future realized returns on individual stocks. As can be shown from this table, cyber risk is a strong and a positive predictor of future returns on individual firms. After control for a number of stock characteristics, in the baseline regression, we have the standard 5 characteristics proposed by Palmer-French, as well as short-term reversal, momentum, etc. So with all these controls, cyber risk remain a strong predictor. So we also expand the number of stock characteristics to include more anomalies based on Green, Zhang et al.'s paper. The results are even stronger. You might also be wondering how about if we control for all the regressors we use to train our LASSO algorithm? So we did that, and we find the effect of cyber risk on stock returns remains large and significant. So these tests are based on realized stock returns. To look at expected stock returns, we compute the implied cost of capital for individual firm. And then we perform the similar FAME-MCBETH regression using cyber risk to predict expected stock returns. We find similar results, essentially. So these two tables are the core findings in terms of how the stock market perceives cyber risk. They show that cyber risk is a strong determinant of expected stock returns. Certainly, there are alternative hypotheses for the findings. You may be wondering, is it really high cyber risk, or is it really more successful digitization? In other words, are we simply capturing the effect of Amazon versus Macy's? We know in our sample period, Amazon has good performance, Macy's doesn't. So are we simply recapturing that? To address that concern, we do a test for each stock in our sample. We find its most similar peer based on the Holberg-Phillips similarity score in product markets. And then we compute the excess return of a given firm against its most similar peer. Then we redo the portfolio analysis and form long-short portfolio, buying high cyber risk stocks and selling low cyber risk stocks. What we found is that for the decile portfolio, the results are almost similar. For the quintile portfolios, it's also very similar. So this addressed the concern that we are not simply capturing firms with more successful digitization. Another test we did is to do a placebo test. For each hacked firm in our sample, we randomly pick one firm in the same industry in the same year. And then we form a pseudo sample of those pseudo hacked firms. And then we repeat all the analysis in the paper using our SAM algorithm and then come up with a pseudo cyber risk measure. Then we look at the connection of that measure with future stock return. Now it's entirely random. There's no relation at all between the pseudo cyber risk and stock returns. So this reinforces the idea that the attack does contain useful information that can capture firms' exposure to cyber risk. So let me now conclude. So we propose a new firm level measure to capture the latent and emerging cyber risk. The evidence supports the notion that cyber risk is an important determinant of expected stock returns in increasingly digitized economies. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Hao, for very nicely distilling the essence of your paper in such a limited time. And let's now move on to Michael. And I suggest that when you are done with your 50-minute presentation, you just continue for the next 7-8 minutes with the sort of discussion. And after that, we'll come back to Hao to get his view.
Yeah, perfect. So like, can you see my slides? Okay, so this is joint work with Chris Florakis at Liverpool, Christodoulos Lucas in Cyprus, and Ronnie Michaeli in Hong Kong. And so like, I think I don't have to motivate after Hao's super nice presentation. What we after, this is just, from some industry reports indicating that CEOs think that cyber attacks on the one hand, a major risk in terms of probability of occurring, but also conditional on materializing might have actually a major impact on the firm's operations. And there's some industry reports indicating that cyber risk could materialize worldwide, damages in the magnitude of 6 trillion, but might even actually double during the COVID pandemic with people working from home, locking into their corporate networks and so on. And so like, it's very similar to what Hao was presenting. We try to come up with a measure of cyber risk at the firm level, then kind of show that it has like reasonable properties and show its price in the cross-section. So the way we do that, we focus on the cyber risk disclosure of firms in 10 cases. And then like, we want to just simply compare like the kind of properties of the language people are using in their cyber risk disclosure of all firms in the US relative to firms that actually were subject to a major cyber attack in the past, and then come up with a measure of similarity. And like in the data, it looks like, this measure has some properties that kind of are intuitive and make sense. I'll come to that in a second. Then we show that in the cross-section, like its price resulting in a return differential of high versus low exposure firms of about 8% per year. And actually, I think, the most direct piece of evidence that it seems to be compensation for risk is like if you use daily returns of a simple cybersecurity risk factor, unconditionally it has like high returns, but on days with a high attention or materialization of the cybersecurity risk, you see that this long-short portfolio, in fact, actually underperforms. And what was suggested to us, and I'll talk briefly about it by a referee. So after our initial submission of the paper, this SolarWind hacks that Hao was mentioning occurred, and we kind of used that kind of as an out-of-sample kind of test to kind of validate also our measure and results. So I think like, before we got aware of Hao and co-author's paper, we were saying like, most of the literature kind of focus on hacked firms or spillovers to unhacked firms. But I think, now there are a couple of papers that actually try to come up with an ex-ante measure of cybersecurity risk. And there's also this very nice paper by Eleni Ray and co-authors. So like, what do we do now empirically to actually propose this measure? So we effectively lever this SEC regulation that on the one hand requires all firms to discuss in this risk factor sections, material risk factors for firms, and crucially specific guidance by the SEC in 2011, 2018, relating to cybersecurity risk and incidents. And then effectively all we are doing, we use this database, Hao was mentioning, this private security database, and focus on all major attacks that happen to our sample period. And simply speaking, we just want to say, like, you know, firms that were actually hacked, most likely ex-ante, you know, they had a high exposure to cyber risk because it materialized. So we will now compare the risk disclosure section discussion of all firms in year T, specifically about cybersecurity risk, to the risk section of firms that were attacked in year T, but we use the section of T-1. And we just want to come up with a measure of similarity, and this will be our measure of cyber risk exposure. You know, just to give you some idea how those discussions about cybersecurity risk actually would look like. So this is from Verizon. They say, well, you know, we haven't been subject to an attack and we try to take measures against it, but, you know, most likely there might be insufficient and there could be a major attack in the future. So now, specifically the way we do that, so now let's go to Edgar, download this risk disclosure sections from 10Ks, focus only on kind of meaningful words, so get rid of stem words, pronouns, conjunctions, and so on, for use word roots rather than the full words. And then you'll see that in those risk disclosure sections focusing on cybersecurity, we have a bit more of 3,000 unique words. And then now for each firm and each year, we simply actually populate this vector with the number of times a given word is actually mentioned in this section. And so, as I already alluded to, we then focus on realized hacks from this non-profit company. And we want to actually make sure that the hacks we use as our training sample were indeed hacks that the market was aware of. So therefore, we cross-validate that these hacks we have from this the data provider were at least covered in one major news outlet, being it like either one of the big newspapers in the US or on one of the big news wires. And this will then be our training sample. And just to give you some idea on what are the type of words that are covered in this data, in this risk disclosure section, here we just have now a word count of the 3,000 words that we have. And like you see, you know, failure, security, information, breach, system, and so on. And so in the paper now, what we do, we actually have two measures of measuring similarity of all firms in year T with past major hacks in T-1. For today, I focus on cosine similarity. Rather, in the paper, we also have like a Jacquard similarity. And so let's say like last year, we had like, or this year, we had like 5 major attacks. So like what we do, we focus on the cybersecurity discussion of all major attacked firms this year from last year. Then for each firm this year, we just calculate the cosine similarity of a given firm with a firm that was attacked. And then just simply like take the average of the firm specific major attacked firm cosine similarity measures. And this will then be our year T measure of cybersecurity risk. And then subsequently in the future, we'll sort later on stocks in portfolios. So we only use information that the market would have been aware of. Just to give you some idea, you know, how do these firms that have a high exposure measure look like? So on the one hand, you know, we already saw Verizon earlier on, like, you know, they tend to mention things that they do take preventive measures, but typically cannot fully rule out that they might be subject to an attack. Their discussion is more lengthier, they discuss more legal consequences, use more precise and negative words, and they mention that they might partially actually insure against future attacks. Now I cannot see my own slides. Let me see. And I'll show you in a second. So like consistent with the SEC guidance, we see that actually the measure is increasing over time, and it's also more prevalent in techie type industries. So this is now just the average measure over time. So here we see that once SEC provided guidance, and in 2018 again, it tends to be increasing. But recall that, you know, for most of our analysis, we exploit cross-sectional variations, so like the time trend is not a big deal for us, but we actually also find, in fact, that the premium associated with cyber risk, in fact, is actually stronger in the second half than the first half of the sample. And here, somewhat similar to what Hao was showing, you know, it's more prevalent, or our exposure measure seems to be larger, like in finance, telco and stuff like that, and less strong so for like it's in oil, gas, and energy. In terms of like firm characteristics, so what we see, higher exposure firms tend to be larger firms, have trade secrets, have high growth, are more profitable, and we also see that they have more negative stock returns or more negative skewness. More crucially, however, if we now take our measure in year T and we aim to predict future realized tax, you see that this measure indeed in T+1 indeed is able to identify a tax. So like a 1 standard deviation increase in the measure, in fact, increases probability of a future attack by about 90%. Now here, simple portfolio sort, simply sort stocks into 3 portfolios. Here we do quarterly rebalancing, and we later on also do like annual or monthly or sort more portfolios, equally weighted, value weighted, raw returns, and all the way to 5-factor alphas. You see that returns are monotonically increasing in our exposure measure, and the long short alphas per month are pretty sizable with high T-stats. So effectively you see that there's a outperformance in terms of higher realized returns of high versus low exposure firms of about up to 8% per year. That's also true, like if you would say, well, maybe it's more concentrated, certain industries and type of firms with high R&D exposure, or firms with lots of patents and stuff like that. If you do a simple double sorts, you tend to see like this long short alpha within, this is directly 5-factor alphas within all type of subset of firms. So it's not driven by specific firms. And here, this is also not a short run phenomenon. So here, simply run FAME-MCBETH regressions, but then actually use your up to 12-month lagged measure of future returns. You see actually it has strong predictive power for returns in the cross section, keeping constant a whole host of possible return predictors, but things that are also correlated with our exposure measure, also the length of the risk factor sessions and stuff like that. And you see actually it's not a short-term phenomenon. I was alluding to that earlier on a little bit. So here to get an idea whether it's just, is it now just that certain type of firms did well over our relatively short sample period, or is it indeed compensation for risk? One way we actually get at that is to say, let's simply create a cybersecurity risk factor. So follow the Farmer-French method. So like sort first based on size, and then you sort based on cybersecurity risk, then you collapse across size and take a long short portfolio, daily returns now. And here we create a simple dummy value that equals 1. If now there's a high Google search volume for search topics, hacker and data breach, again, only using past information, nothing forward looking, when we define a high SVI dummy. And here you see that, unconditionally, you get like an alpha of about 5% per year using daily returns, but on days with a high attention to cyber risks, you see that high cybersecurity risk stocks relative to low cybersecurity risk stocks actually underperform. So this is like direct evidence when heightened risk materializes, indeed, actually those high risk, high exposure stocks underperform. Now, in terms of, like I mentioned it earlier, also briefly, get some idea that our measure has also like some out of sample predictive power. So here we just use the measure we had constructed before we had submitted initially the paper, and then actually show that our ex-ante measure relative to the solar wind hacks on the one hand can predict which type of firms were exposed to the hack relative to unexposed firms. Measures firms that have a high exposure also actually have a negative cumulative abnormal returns in a 3-day window around the hacks relative to low exposure firms. And we also show, like, have a little bit more of evidence now, hopefully, when we post the new version of the draft by the weekend. I was discussing that with Michael earlier. We wanted to post it already several weekends ago and haven't done so, but we have a more extensive discussion of this episode. Let me just in the last minute or so briefly mention a few other things we do in the paper. So like I mentioned earlier, like you see that due to the SEC guidance, actually our measure, in fact, is increasing at the firm level, but also more firms actually start disclosing or discussing cyber risk. We show that, it's true in both samples, first half, second half, but in fact, actually there's a larger premium in the second half. We discussed earlier that firms partially insure. If you would say, well, to the extent you could fully insure, you shouldn't actually earn a premium. So results are stronger if you exclude firms that partially insure against cyber risk. We also show that if you throw out firms in our training sample, results actually are very similar. We show that once you use industry-adjusted returns or throw out one or two industries at a time, because you know, it's maybe tech industries did super well in the last decade. Those are high exposure firms, and we showed that actually like trading costs are unlikely to be an issue. So maybe like, you know, to not go over time. One more thing I briefly want to mention is like, you know, there has been now over the last couple of years a series of super nice papers using text-based information to create measures of risk at the firm level, being at climate risk or being at political, non-political, and overall risk. And we show that, you know, once you control for these firm level risk exposures, you know, on the one hand, there's a super low correlation with our exposure to cyber risk. And they also actually don't drive anything away from the predictive power of cyber risk exposure for a cross-sectional return premium. And so let me wrap up. And so, like, you know, similar aim to Hao and co-authors, you know, we try to come up with a firm-specific measure, ex-ante measure of exposure to cyber risk. We show that its properties that are kind of, you know, intuitive and make sense and would expect for firms that have a high exposure to have. And we show that, you know, in the cross-section of firms, it is priced and earns a cross-section return premium of up to like 8% per year. So, now, given that I have now the privilege to continue talking, so let me just maybe discuss a few points. Like you saw, obviously, you know, the motivation is very similar. I think the methods are slightly different, but I think it's actually super nice and reassuring, in fact, that actually using some very different methods, we actually reach very similar conclusions. We also actually, you know, it looks like have had very similar type of concerns. You know, is it just realized returns versus expected returns? We try to get it at slightly different angles. I really like this evidence of Hao and co-authors on the implied cost of capital. You know, maybe I should go back and read in more detail their paper. So I think the first version I had read, they mainly had focused on trading behavior of institutional investors, and I hadn't seen like all those results on the stock returns. But I right now in the short 15 minutes was too fast for me to understand like how the magnitudes would line up for realized return versus implied cost of capital. You know, the only thing I noticed, one number was 1, the other was 0.2. Maybe it would be useful just for me to understand how the two numbers actually would compare, how we actually can understand them. I also actually like this new focus on this identity theft resource database that Hao and co-authors are using. Maybe something that would be interesting to discuss is whether, you know, what are the type of firms, given that your sample on hacked firms expands so much, that are in addition in this database relative to the ones we both had used previously. Now, are market participants likely aware of that? So something like that, I would think it's actually would be quite interesting to know. Like in terms of this negative correlation of the ETF and the portfolio, I think that's super cool evidence. And so, like, you know, we had looked at Google search volume, but I think again, like, you know, there's so many complementary pieces of evidence that's actually super nice to see that it holds up across different ways of looking at the data. Let's see, what else did I do? You know, maybe one thing, and I'm sure that it won't have a big impact. So, like, you know, maybe look at industry adjusted returns, and also like, given that it's in industries that actually typically have high R&D exposure, control for R&D spending, or maybe patterns. And we noticed that actually, you know, idiosyncratic volatility seems to be strongly correlated also with our exposure measure. So maybe adding that as an additional covariate. And, you know, this is just for me because I was too slow. I didn't fully understand how you actually come up with this placebo test. What we have done now as part of our revision was that we actually say, let's take our same sample of training firms, focus on risk section discussion other than cybersecurity risk, construct our similarity measure, and just see whether, you know, similarity of our firms with training firms in risk sections other than cyber risk might still actually predict returns. On the one hand, our cyber exposure measure and the other risk exposure measure has a super low correlation, and the other exposure measure actually has no return prediction. So let me just stop it here and I guess hand it back to Hao.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Michael, for the presentation and the feedback. So How, what do you think? How do you see those two papers relative to each other, and what are the lessons we learn, and any different lessons perhaps that we learned from them?
Thank you very much, Michael. And I think you have taken my main points. Yeah, so I really like the paper. The first time I read it, my first reaction is that this is a really nice auto sample test for us. When we are doing this piece of work, the kind of the concern that we have really is about the estimate of cyber risk. There's so much uncertainty involved with the estimates that in the end, we're quite worried, what if we get this wrong? So it's very nice to see, using a very different method, you kind of paint a similar picture in a very broad sense. That's really nice, and I really like that. So very much intrigued by your paper, we decide to replicate your work and kind of construct your measure also and compare that with ours. So what's very encouraging for us is that the two measures have a positive correlation. So they point to the same direction. However, the magnitude of the correlation is only mild, which means that we kind of capture a different dimension of the cyber risk. So for that, one conjecture I have is that we kind of focus on the probability of cyber attack. So that's our kind of key measurement in terms of dimension of cyber risk. But we are kind of silent regarding the expected losses given the cyber attack. There might be some correlation, but it's not what we capture empirically. But your paper kind of points to that. So my conjecture is that we are capturing different dimensions of cyber risk. They're correlated, which is great, but also they contain different information. So that's kind of my main take, from your work. Yeah. So while reading your paper, I'm just thinking about in the broad sense. So you decide to choose a kind of very supervised approach to come up with this measure, which is very nice. I'm just wondering, when you're designing your test, have you thought about, let's say, using a more data-driven approach, like topic modeling for those hacked firms? That way you can endogenize, the dictionary of a vocabulary. You can, connect to the cyber risk. So that to me is something potentially interesting. But I guess your paper is very advanced now, so probably maybe just provide some thoughts on that. That would be nice. And also, I think the technique you are using has wide applicability, not just cyber risk, but also other type of ESG risk. All this kind of linguistic, information that can be exploited. That's really interesting. About your question on this pseudo cyber risk measure we come up with, it's pretty simple. So basically, we are saying, let's say we have this actual hack in our sample. Then we just, let's say for a given firm, we look at the industry, the two-digit SIG industry. We randomly pick a firm from that industry. And then for all the attacks, we come up with a randomly selected pseudo hack sample. And then we use this as our kind of, the training target. And then we, recompute the measure and find this pseudo cyber attack basically has no relation to stock returns, etc. So which kind of illustrates the point that the attack does contain lots of information about cyber risk exposures. So yeah, those are my main points. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hao. Michael, since we have a few minutes left, anything you would like to add before we take questions from the audience?
So I think, maybe picking up on Hao's commoner question on why we chose, a pretty supervised method. So like, with Andy now here in courses, we have in the past, ventured out a little bit and used more, for standard finance audience exotic methods, and realized that's maybe not necessarily the way to go. So we decided this time actually to just do as simple of an approach as possible that's transparent and replicable. So like the fact that you were able to replicate our paper, it's a good sign. And so like that was our major guiding principle. And I agree that there are different applications and ways we could actually lever that going forward indeed.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, both of you, for presenting and comparing your contributions. And I guess that's the right moment to thank you once again, Hao and Michael, for joining the webinar and for contributing to the series. It was great to have both of you here. It was great to experiment with this new format. I hope you enjoyed it too. Let me also just remind everyone, there is one more episode left this year. In 2 weeks, we will have Andrew Qian from the Federal Reserve Board, who was actually in the audience today, presenting on another blockbuster topic, which is the statistical reliability of anomaly findings in financial economics. So thank you everyone for joining today, and I hope to see you again in 2 weeks.